Welcome back to this digital space in which staying in the physical realm and explaining things by slapping cards on playmats doesn't quite do the explanation justice. Today, we'll be discussing the Nirvana and Vairina deck of Dragon Empire, used by the protagonist of the overdress anime Yu Yu Kondo. This video was initially supposed to come out in early June, but unfortunately due to the busy period of Bushort Springfest Online, it's been delayed to now, July 2021. Oh dear. Anyway, in today's video, we'll be breaking down the Nirvana deck with its D-BT01 and Festival Collection support, as the deck changes a fair bit with D-BT02 and there has not been enough personal testing of the new support to speak of it confidently just yet. Look forward to an updated deck profile in the future with the English release hopefully as close to D-BT02's release as possible. This video will contain the following chapters: the concept of the deck, key cards, the tech cards, the Mulligan, the right deck discards, optimal plays, and matchups across all existing 10 ride lines, as well as some example deck lists. Videos like this take a very long time to produce, so if you like what you see, please do leave a like and share with your friends that may be interested in the deck or how to play against it. The Nirvana deck at its core is a tempo deck. While you may try to play it as an aggro deck, as I did at first and had nothing but losses, the deck rewards you for understanding how to control tempo, push damage appropriately, threaten the opponent with skills like that of Vairina Valiente, and go for finishing plays when appropriate. The deck is able to achieve high power attacks very consistently thanks to how generic Nirvana's buffing skill is, buffing not just units in the overdressed state, but even if they're just overdressed skill possessing units that aren't even overdressed. By pushing with 23k, 33k plus attacks every turn, you're able to corner your opponent or deplete their hand quickly. There are two key factors in adding to this tempo-based playstyle. First is overdressing your Trickstar at appropriate timings. There are many times where it's better to just call a vanilla Vairina or Valiente without overdressing, especially if you're playing against something that can retire your rearguards easily or remove them otherwise, such as Baramagnus. Vairina Arcs is an exception due to being a walking pot of greed, but even then, this breaks in the second key factor: careful CB usage to keep the resource and pressure flow going. This factor is twofold. While we love using arcs on turn 2, it's often better to overdress it in the back row if you only have 1 damage, since otherwise your opponent can just attack the arcs next turn, passing back to your turn where you're still on 1 damage but have no open counterblast to use Nirvana's effect to control the tempo. Second, on Persona right turns, it's often a question whether you should use Nirvana's effect. Your columns are already hitting for 23k plus, so it takes a careful assessment of your opponent's hand from past drive checks and hand size to see if that extra 10k pump to your front row will be worth it, or if they'll just take those big attacks and get back to their plays next turn. These are the core concepts in playing Nirvana efficiently. Now that we've spoken about the concept, let's go over the key cards for this deck. Of course, the right deck is the first set of cards that will most likely stay as key cards for a very long time. The egg isn't necessarily a special card, as all nations have one starter with the same effect, but it's actually got reasons to be picked as the starting Vanguard in this deck, which is of course the extra draw going second. As a tempo deck, you do value additional cards a lot, especially going second against more aggressive matchups or ones that have great power spikes on turn 3. We'll talk about the other starting Vanguard options a bit later. Now let's look at Rino and Ryu. These are basically your engine that turns on your plays and helps the general consistency of the deck, as most ride lines do. Rino sets up the Trickstar on your board for the optimal turn 2 arcs for extra card draw, whereas Ryu gives you the Vairina surge for the power plays with Nirvana on turn 3. Finally, Nirvana itself, quite literally the face of the deck, unless you're like me and feel that Trickstar and Vairina are so cool that they kind of surpass Nirvana for being the face of the deck. Oops. Nirvana is a great grade 3 boss unit, giving you the grade 0 revive once per turn that lets you revive your Trickstars for potential overdresses when necessary, and most importantly, that plus 10k pump to itself and the units with the overdress ability that allows you to have more control over the pace of the game, threatening your opponent with the high burst of power. Next, let's give a little spotlight to the units searched by the ride line, Trickstar and base Vairina. Trickstar itself might not seem like much more than just a target to overdress onto, but the not being selected by effects part of it actually covers certain matchups entirely, such as Prison. Base Vairina has some use as well. While Soul Blast 2 for a retire is quite expensive, going first against something like Bruce is an interesting interaction where you can retire their mat before the Richard can put it back into the soul for the extra draw, or against Stoichea you can sometimes Soul Blast 2 to retire a Ghost Chase target. Now, the next two Vairina forms. One is definitely better than the other, but I think even Valiente might stick around for quite a while due to it being such an easy, strong number to pump with Nirvana. Vairina Arcs, as previously stated, is a pot of greed with legs. This is the card you mulligan for and the card that you always want to sink your counterblast into unless you're about to deck out. The draw 2 helps you reach your Persona rides, as well as dig for more cards to stay in the game against whatever your opponent is trying to throw at you. Valiente, on the other hand, is your main pressure tool in the deck at the moment. Don't be fooled. While CB1 discard 1 to restand it and attack again might seem like it's great, in a way this can be the beginner trap for the deck as well. Hell, even the anime had to make a point out of this. Valiente is primarily there for two reasons: to be a fantastic beat stick and to make your opponent drop their cards to guard it. Even if it hits, you very rarely actually use the skill to restand it, since the discard 1 is just too big of a loss when you're trying to win on tempo, even if it doesn't seem like it in the moment. Of course, if your opponent barely has any cards in hand and that last Valiente attack will determine the game, then that's definitely a good time to go for it. Just keep in mind that 80% of the time, the on-hit effect is there to pressure the opponent to fear the restand rather than to actually commit for the restand. Now that we've established the core cards, let's look at some options that are primarily seeing a lot of play in the Set 1/Festival Collection meta, but will most likely not see much play as the deck evolves with future sets, as is already being seen from D-BT02. The first so-called tech is having Trickstar as your starting Vanguard. The main reason for this is actually Ryu. As she uses Soul Blast 1 to search for Vairina, you're able to put the Trickstar starter directly into your drop zone to be revived by Nirvana, thus allowing you to have a double overdress setup as early as turn 3 due to the Reno search on turn 2. However, it's been found that generally you still prefer the extra draw from the egg, and as long as you open arcs, you can generally find your second Trickstar throughout the course of the game. The next tech that seems like it'll fall off in set 2 is the Burn Bright Pure Prayers Blitz Order. The use of it is very simple. Once you have 3 damage or more, it's another 15k shield in your deck, and if you run draw triggers, these will basically compensate for the shield loss you get from not having fronts, but keep in mind, you can only cast 1 Blitz Order per turn. The grade 1s are definitely the most convoluted space, as we've seen various trends differing across the regions. In Japan, many players were seen running Tenshasted, an additional card with a counterblast cost, but allowing you to search a copy of your Vanguard, which ensures smooth Persona riding. However, it still needs to hit, which adds to the tempo control that Valiente has, and if it does, you really need to consider if that CB1 self-retire is worth over a potential arcs, but in the end the CB1 does convert, as Persona riding basically means the same as Nirvana's skill due to them both giving an effective plus 10k to your front row next turn, with the Persona ride giving you an extra draw as well. Veloki Hazard has been seen as a popular pick in many regions, being a simple 10k booster that primarily functions to make your Valiente and Nirvana columns even stronger, immediately jumping from 23k, 33k to 43k and above. Alternatively to this, we've seen a development of a more aggressive style that runs 3 additional Renos in the main deck, as she functions as a 10k attacker that can push well in the early turns and is still an effective attacker throughout the game. It's primarily between these two grade 1s that most people choose to finish out their deck list. The latest consideration in the grade 1 slots is the newly released Mirin from Festival Collection. She's generally quite neat. She provides soul, so you can use base Vairina's skill more often. That extra 5k pump helps to solidify numbers as well, but the big downside to her is the fact that her base power is only 6,000. You can still make 29k columns with things like Valiente and Nirvana, but when you think that those could have been 33k with Veloki Hazard, it does feel a little bad. In general, I think for now her potential isn't fully there yet, but she is a card worth considering in the list. That generally rounds out the core staples as well as tech cards for the deck, so now let's discuss what you mulligan for and what you discard for the ride deck. The mulligan in this deck is very straightforward. This deck heavily relies on opening Vairina arcs. Again, a walking pot of greed is not to be underestimated in any deck, so sometimes you might want to put back all 5 cards to ensure you can draw into that arcs as early as possible. The next card you'd keep is of course Nirvana itself. Persona rides are something that can greatly dictate tempo, and in this tempo based deck that is always going to be very important. Finally, in certain matchups, you do need to hold on to your perfect guards, especially going second, so that may be worth holding on to, but only if you've already secured your arcs. For the right deck discards, Trickstar is currently the best. You can always revive it with Nirvana, so having it in hand is rarely needed, unless you really do need 2 on the field on some specific turn and you had your other one removed from an early overdress. Next, most lists do still run draw triggers, so that's always a safe card to discard for the right deck as well. Finally, excess copies of base Vairina are often fine to be discarded, as this is the form of Vairina that we go into the least. If you have too many Burn Bright, Pure Prayers, or Veloci Hazard, they're always considered good discard targets, since you often don't need to have too many per game. And now, it's finally time to step into the actual gameplay phase of this explanation. The following will be general gameplay tips that will help the deck run more efficiently, and general pointers you should always keep in mind. You should also keep these in mind if you're playing against the deck, because you'll know what the Nirvana player wants to prioritize. First, if your opponent only gives you 1 damage on their first attacking turn, you often want to overdress arcs in the back row. The reason for this is that if you do it in the front row, next turn the opponent can just attack into it, thus denying you any counterblast for the next turn. By doing it in the back row, your Vanguard remains the only valid attack target, and thus you get given counterblast for Nirvana or Vairina arcs next turn. Next, on Personarite turns, you really need to ask yourself if it's worth the counterblast for Nirvana's effect. 23k on the Vanguard is already going to be at least a 2-card guard if they wanted to pass it, or a perfect guard, so it's a question of how much more 33k will actually push. It's more relevant on the rear guards, where they're more likely to guard with raw shield value, but you should always think ahead and see where your counterblast usage is going. Overdressing the base Vairina is quite situational and matchup dependent. As previously mentioned, this is good in the mirror, good against Stoicheia to deny Ghost Chase, and of course great against Bruce going first to deny their Richard. It does get an extra 10k power from being overdressed, but you should always look out to make sure that the extra card investment to overdress it doesn't get negated by your opponent having a retire effect or Bastion bot decking it, which of course goes for Valiente as well. As previously mentioned, Valiente's skill is mainly there for pressure rather than to be committed to. Read the game state carefully and see where it is appropriate to actually counterblast for the restand, but we've already spoken about this quite a bit in the earlier parts of the video. The final main pair of tips depends on the build you play. If you run Tenchestead, the tempo control and pressure exists even more so than before, but you once again have to be careful with where you commit your counterblast to. On the other hand, more Renos allow you for greater aggro and pushing your opponent to 4 damage early, in which Nirvana will help to finish off your opponent with a great power boost earlier than in other builds. However, keep in mind that aggressing early with Renos still opens up the opportunity for you to get CB denied if you arcs early. And now, the part that sets this video aside from regular deck profiles, let's talk about matchups. The first matchup, of course, is the mirror. The mirror match is quite interesting. Base Vairina essentially checks itself by removing overdressed cards from the board, and both players will often try to dance around giving each other counterblast. Of course, this one isn't favored one way or another, and it mostly comes down to how well you control the counterblast availabilities of your opponent and keeping base Vairina for key moments to deny Valiente setups, and of course, Valiente itself. The Eugene matchup is interestingly twofold with how the deck has evolved. Many Eugene players use it very aggressively and rush from as early as possible, which technically opens up extra counterblast, which allows you to overdress arcs in the front row without fear of being counterblast denied. However, Eugene can immediately check any Vairina form that is overdressed with its pinpoint retire, so the moment Eugene goes up to grade 3, this can give the Nirvana deck a tough time. Be careful with when you overdress your Valientes and base arcs, and you should generally be okay in this matchup. This matchup might surprisingly be unfavored. The Bruce matchup is very mixed. This is a very grindy, long game deck that runs defensive options, and once it reaches the late game, it can generally overpower you with its multi-attacks. Going first, you do have the option to deny their Richard with base Vairina and push the aggression before they can get to their intense final rush turns, but going second, that play doesn't exist, and Eden doesn't make it easier either. Eden can actually attack you and force you to self-deny your counterblast, as it hitting and giving you a counterblast means they'll retire your arcs in the back row, so it's just a tough situation through and through. Unfavored. Barrow Magnus. This matchup is one that really benefits an experienced Nirvana player. On surface level, it might seem unfavored, as the Barrow player often turbos to 15 soul, and now your overdressed Vairinas and Trickstars are all going to the soul, and it feels virtually impossible to close out the game. However, keep in mind that in the early game, Barrow Magnus uses virtually every single card in the hand to actually reach that 15 soul, thus can't afford to guard anything. This is where you put the helmet on and embrace the monkey life, as it's time to rush them down before they reach 15 soul, and they'll be forced to drop the combo parts and fail to reach 15 soul, with you fully controlling the tempo in many cases. I believe this one is favored. Bastion. Here, it depends which build of Bastion you're playing against. In general, you're favored going first in this matchup, but going second can be really rough due to how this deck just erupts on turn 3. However, Control Bastion makes everything so much worse, as they will try to consistently bot deck your Vairinas and Trickstars with the downswing order, so this makes the matchup very hard. If you're playing against a pure grade 3 rushdown build, you can generally capitalize off of their hand being mostly grade 3s and push going first, but again, going second, this isn't as easy. Overall, I think this is unfavored. Against Hexa Orb, they generally have their power spike on turn 4, with Lepisto and Persona Ride allowing them to stack triggers and gain an extra drive, but luckily Arcs gives us the cards necessary to survive that push. This is also a matchup that I'm quite happy keeping a PG in my Mulligan. After that power spike, it really depends how hard they went on stacking their triggers, but generally you have the tempo and pressure throughout the entire game to hold them down and survive their own power spike. Keep taking those important pieces out of their hand with your turn 3 push. I think this one is favored. Magnolia. A deck that rushes you down and generally has a low hand since they're committing to that rush so much. Thanks for the free arcs and no need to put it in the back row either. The early rush they give you often lets you build up a hand and use Nirvana freely as well, and generally speaking their hand is often too small to survive the consistent push that Nirvana can output. Also, base Vairina can deny their pieces on board too. Favored unless you don't open arcs or your second Trickstar. Zorga. This matchup is way less one-sided than the Magnolia one. As you've probably seen in the fight we did with Solom on his channel, it took so many Persona Rides to actually finish off a Zorga player. They farm so much, generate such a big hand due to not having to call from hand much, and can output the same level of power as you without even playing much from hand. You do have the option to use base Vairina to deny Ghost Chase targets, but even then, they can tank so many of your plays, which you rely on arcs to be able to replicate to any extent. Overall, feels fairly unfavored. Seraph Snow. Triple Trickstar back row. Until set 2 comes out, this is quite literally the counter that never allows them to get to 3 cards in prison. Other than that, you can arcs turn 2 for the extra draw, let it get imprisoned, then bring them back separately, and from here on, don't overdress again and put those Trickstars in the back row. At least until set 2, this is definitely Nirvana favored. Orphist. This one's interesting. Both decks do very similar things, Nirvana just has a bit more power. Both decks have big hands, where you do thanks to arcs, and Orphist because they don't call much from hand. However, Orphist likes to early rush in order to have their own tempo control, thus giving you the option to use arcs and bash back as well. I think this matchup is quite equal, although if the Orphist player suddenly plays more control based and starts bashing at your Vairinas, it can quickly turn unfavored. I think this is probably the most back and forth matchup so far, mainly because of how similar the decks are in their objectives. And that summarizes the 10 existing ride lines and their matchups. I hope this helps you grasp Nirvana's position in the format, so now let's take a look at some example deck lists, since I'm sure many of you want to see where to get started. We'll be looking at 3 deck lists, but you'll notice that all of them share the majority of the list aside from the grade ones you choose to tech. With that out the way, let's look at these deck lists. This first list uses Veloki Hazard as the main tech grade 1, as it allows us to make the Valiente and Nirvana columns even stronger than before. This build has seen most popularity across the globe in general, as you just get to always ask your opponent to drop big chunks of shield compared to the other variants. This is also the build that I've played for the longest time since release as well, so I do greatly recommend it. The second list has been most commonly seen in Japan in particular, as now not only is Vairina Valiente your main pressure point, but the other Tensha stat column will be as well. This also helps to make your base Vairina or Arcs columns nice and threatening as well. Just keep in mind not to overcommit your counterblast usage. Feel free to try out this variant as well. Finally, if you're looking for a more aggressive playstyle, the Reno tech choice may be the one for you. Allows you to push your opponent to 4 damage a bit earlier, thus allowing you to reach that big pressure point with Nirvana's power pump even faster. Just keep in mind that this does open you to being CB denied even easier, but this is also the list that I've changed to now as well while we await the D-BT02 English release. And that wraps up this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this added insight and information for the Nirvana deck compared to regular deck profiles. Unfortunately, as videos like these take a very long time to make, they will most likely not happen too often, especially due to the playtesting necessary to be able to comment on all the matchups. You can look forward to future deck profiles of the Nirvana deck to see how it evolves with D-BT02 and beyond, as there will be a lot to talk about. If you enjoyed this video, please do leave a like and leave any feedback you may have, and of course share it with your friends as well. It really does help a lot. If you need to pick up any of the cards, you can also check out parkage.com and use discount code DifferentFight for a 5% discount at checkout, as it does help out the channel. Otherwise, that's it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.